We cannot give up, my little ones. Old Elias, his voice choked by coughs and despair, clutched his two feverish grandchildren against his body as the biting snow whipped their exhausted faces. Driven from his lands and hunted like an animal, he had promised his late wife that he would never abandon Leo and Maya, now sick and on the verge of exhaustion. The hope of an abandoned city, Ethelberg, seemed a distant blessing, but when the rusted gates creaked open to the sepulchral silence of that desolate village, an icy shiver, unrelated to the cold, ran down his spine. And what he would find in the shadows of that forgotten place would reveal not only an ancient secret, but the very essence of the curse that pursued them and the destiny of his lineage. Ethelberg's silence was heavier than the snow covering its ruins, a funereal shroud that muffled every sound, every hope. Elias felt the icy shiver, not just from the cold that pierced his bones, but from the abyssal solitude emanating from that place. The rusted gates, which had opened with a mournful groan, now closed behind them, sealing them in a world of stone and ice. Leo, nestled in his arms, coughed weakly, his small body trembling beneath layers of cloth. Maya, clinging to her grandfather's back, murmured something inaudible, her breath a faint thread against Elias's neck. Their pale faces, marked by fever, were a constant reminder of the promise he had made, never to give up. With a sigh that turned to vapor in the frigid air, Elias adjusted the weight of his grandchildren and took the first step into the cursed city. The streets, once vibrant, were now mere paths of untouched snow, flanked by skeletons of houses and buildings that rose like ghosts beneath the grey sky. Every step was an effort, every breath of air froze his lungs, hunger gnawed at his stomach. But the sharpest pain was seeing his little ones wasting away. He needed shelter, warmth, something that could soothe the fever consuming them. His tired red eyes swept the desolate horizon, searching for any sign of refuge, any glimmer of hope in that scene of desolation. A more robust structure, though partially collapsed, caught his eye in the distance. Perhaps an ancient temple or a town hall whose massive stone walls still resisted time and winter. With renewed determination, Elias began to drag himself in that direction, his heart pounding in his chest, driven by a love that transcended his own exhaustion. He pressed Leo closer, feeling the boy's faint body heat, a painful reminder of his fragility. "We're almost there, my loves," he whispered, his voice hoarse, more to himself than to them, trying to instill courage in his own wavering spirit. Maya let out a whimper, and Elias felt a pang of guilt for every slow step, for every second they spent exposed to the inclement cold. Finally, he reached the structure. It was a temple, as he had imagined, its imposing columns broken and fallen, the roof partially collapsed. But an inner section still offered some protection from the biting wind. With extreme care, Elias laid Leo and Maya on the snow-covered ground, in a corner that seemed less exposed. His stiff fingers could barely untie the blankets, but he persisted, covering his grandchildren with everything they had, trying to create a nest of warmth. He sat between them, embracing them again, using his own body as a shield against the cold. Leo opened his eyes for an instant, a faint glimmer of recognition before closing them again, sinking into feverish unconsciousness. Maya, with her cold little hand, clung to his tunic, a gesture of dependence that broke the old man's heart. Darkness began to fall, and with it, the cold intensified. Elias felt despair gnaw at the edges of his courage, but the image of his wife, smiling and trusting him, reappeared in his mind, a beacon in the darkness. He could not fail. Not now. His eyes scanned the temple walls, searching for something, anything that could offer a spark of hope. There were ancient inscriptions, almost erased by time and dampness, but one in particular seemed to catch his eye, slightly clearer, hidden behind a partially collapsed column. It was a silent promise, a whisper from a forgotten past, which might hold the key to his grandchildren's future. With the last drop of energy, he leaned in to examine it, his breath held as the wind howled outside, a mournful lullaby for the sleeping city. Ethelberg might be cursed, but for Elias, at that moment, it was the only chance left. He needed to unravel its secrets before time and illness took his precious grandchildren forever. The inscription was indeed ancient, carved in a script that time had almost erased, but which still held a mystery. Elias, with tired eyes and vision blurred by age and exhaustion, had to lean in very close, almost touching the cold stone with his nose. His wrinkled fingers, still trembling from the effort and the penetrating cold, traced the contours of the letters, feeling the depth of each groove. "Here, where the veil tears between the forgotten and the eternal," he murmured, deciphering the words one by one, his mind struggling to connect the fragments. Purity resides, not in gold or power, but in the essence that nourishes life. With each word understood, a spark of hope, as fragile as his grandchildren's lives, ignited in his chest. He felt Leo's body tremble slightly in his arms, an urgent reminder of time mercilessly slipping away. The inscription continued, a poetic enigma that spoke of waters that wash away pain and restore the soul, of a heart of stone that guards the secret. Elias looked around, searching for a heart of stone among the ruins. His eyes fell upon a section of the wall that looked slightly different, a larger, darker stone than the others, at the center of an almost imperceptible circular pattern. With an effort that seemed to tear the last fiber of his strength, he reached out and pressed. Nothing. He tried again, this time with more force and growing desperation, and a faint creak echoed in the sepulchral silence of the temple. The stone, with a slow, dragging movement, gave way inward, revealing a small, dark niche, hidden for centuries. Inside the niche, wrapped in an old, dusty cloth that almost disintegrated at his touch, was a scroll. Elias's hands trembled as he pulled it out. Carefully, he unrolled the ancient material, revealing a map. It was not a map of treasures or distant kingdoms, but a simple, crude map of Ethelberg itself, with markings he had never noticed in the ruins around him. A dotted line led from the temple into the depths of the city, winding through the collapsed structures, ending in a symbol that looked like a drop of water within a circle. Below the symbol, in clearer, still legible script, it read, "The Fountain of Life, the Fountain of Life." A wave of overwhelming emotion washed over him. Warm tears streamed down his wrinkled face, mixing with the cold sweat that already covered him. It was not a treasure of gold, but something far more precious, the promise of healing, the promise that could save Leo and Maya. He clutched the scroll to his chest, his heart beating with renewed strength, but also with a deep fear of the unknown. His eyes turned to his grandchildren. Leo and Maya, nestled beside him, seemed even more fragile under the faint light filtering through the temple's cracks. Maya's breath was an almost inaudible whisper, and the heat of Leo's fever seemed to burn through the blankets, even in the biting cold of the environment. With each weak cough, each subtle whimper, Elias's despair renewed itself, but now with a clear purpose. He looked at the map again, his eyes tracing the route with meticulous attention. It seemed a long and dangerous path, through unstable ruins and deep snow that accumulated in treacherous drifts. The scroll, though ancient, was surprisingly detailed, showing narrow alleys and passages he would never have noticed. But hope, once a dying ember, now burned in his chest like a stubborn flame, fueled by the image of his grandchildren running and playing, healthy and full of life. He didn't know what he would find on the way, nor if he would have the strength to get there, with his bones aching and hunger gnawing. But the idea of a healing spring, a chance to see them smiling again, was a balm for his exhausted soul. He had to try, for them, for his late wife who trusted him, for all he had lost and which could now be restored. Ethelberg, the cursed city, suddenly transformed into a labyrinth of hope, and Elias, the old widower, was ready to face every turn and every shadow, guided only by the map in his hands and his unwavering love for his family. Night advanced, but for Elias, the dawn of a new possibility had already begun to break through the darkness of his despair. There was no time to lose. Every second Leo and Maya spent consumed by fever was a second less of hope. With the map tightly rolled and tucked against his chest, Elias knelt between his grandchildren, his eyes sweeping over their pale, sweaty faces. Leo whimpered softly, his breath ragged, and Maya trembled uncontrollably, even beneath the blankets. "My little warriors," he whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Grandpa has found the way. We will find the cure, I promise." He kissed each of their warm foreheads, feeling the urgency burning in his own heart, a flame that refused to be extinguished. With redoubled care, Elias began to prepare his grandchildren for the journey. He unfolded their thickest blanket, wrapping Leo first, with the delicacy of one handling a fragile treasure, then Maya securing them firmly to his back and chest, respectively, using strips of cloth he had carefully saved. It was a heavy burden, yes, but the love he felt for them was an even greater burden, and this he would carry with joy to the ends of the earth, if need be. The cold in the temple seemed to intensify with each passing minute, and the wind outside howled like a hungry wolf, promising a night of trials. He knew the night would be brutal, but the fountain of life was the only light at the end of the tunnel, the only promise that kept him on his feet. Finally, with his grandchildren secure and the map in hand, Elias took the first step out of the temple. The darkness was almost total. Only the flickering moonlight, filtered by heavy clouds, offered some faint visibility. The snow, now deeper and untouched, crunched under his feet, and the icy air cut his exposed skin like 1,000 needles. He consulted the map, tracing the route with his wrinkled finger, trying to memorize every turn and landmark. The first part of the path was a narrow alley between two collapsed houses, a labyrinth of shadows and rubble that seemed to swallow them. Every step was a battle against knee-deep snow and the precarious balance of the ruins. His muscles screamed in protest, but he ignored them, focusing only on following the scroll's markings with iron determination. "Slowly, Grandpa." He heard Maya's faint voice, a thread of sound that made him stop abruptly, his heart tightening. She was conscious, even if for a brief moment, and that was a sign, a small victory. He turned his head as much as he could, trying to see the girl's face, but the darkness and Leo's weight prevented him. "We're going, my love, almost there," he lied softly, knowing there was still a long way to go, but hope needed to be nurtured. The touch of her cold little hand on his shoulder was a shock, an adrenaline injection that spurred him on. Leo, for his part, remained in a worrying silence, his breathing irregular, a sound that pierced Elias's heart. The fear that they wouldn't endure the journey was a constant shadow, but Elias wouldn't let it dominate him, pushing it away with the strength of his will. He dragged himself through a section where a house's roof had collapsed, creating a mountain of snow-covered wood and stone. The map indicated a detour, a secret passage he would never have found without the ancient guidance. With difficulty, he squeezed through a narrow crevice, his body aching, his grandchildren weighing in his arms like anchors, but also like his purpose. With each obstacle overcome, a small victory was achieved, a momentary relief, but exhaustion accumulated, weighing on his shoulders. His lungs burned with each gulp of icy air, and hunger, which he had forgotten for a while, returned to gnaw at his stomach with ferocity, reminding him of his own fragility. The map led him to a snow-covered square, where a decapitated statue of some ancient ruler stood, a silent testament to time and the transience of human glory. The wind swept the snow in whirlwinds, whipping his face, almost blinding him. He felt tiny and insignificant before the vastness of that dead city, but the image of the fountain of life, the promise of healing, shimmered in his mind like a beacon. He pressed his grandchildren closer, feeling the faint warmth of their bodies, a constant reminder of his unwavering purpose. "We won't stop," he promised himself, with every step, every breath. His inner voice a silent cry in the icy wilderness. The journey was long, the night was cold, but Elias's faith was unshakable. He would continue, even if he had to crawl, until his grandchildren were safe and healed. Dawn was still far off, but hope for Elias had already broken through the darkness of that endless night, illuminating every uncertain step. Elias, with his grandchildren pressed against him, left the square of the decapitated statue. The wind still whipped his face, but the image of the healing spring was a shield against the cold and despair. His eyes, now more accustomed to the gloom, followed the map's indications, which guided him through a tangle of alleys and ruined buildings. Every step was a struggle against the snow that seemed to want to swallow him, and the silence of the night was broken only by the crunch of snow under his boots. He felt his leg muscles burn, his shoulders ache under the precious weight. But with each breath, he repeated to himself, "For them, always for them." The route indicated by the scroll became increasingly complex, leading him to what seemed to be the heart of the abandoned city, where the buildings were taller and denser, creating almost impenetrable tunnels of darkness. In one of these stretches, he stumbled over a stone block hidden by the snow, and for an instant, gravity threatened to pull him down. Elias's heart pounded. He clung to a collapsed wall, his stiff fingers finding precarious support. Leo let out a faint whimper, and Elias felt Maya tremble. "Forgive me, my loves," he whispered, his voice choked by exhaustion and fright. He recomposed himself, adrenaline coursing through his veins, a cruel reminder of his own fragility and the responsibility he carried. Leo's fever seemed to have risen. The heat emanating from the boy's small body was almost unbearable for Elias, even in the biting cold. Maya's breath was such a faint whisper that the old man leaned in to make sure she was still there, alive. Fear was a constant companion, a cold shadow trying to infiltrate his mind, whispering doubts. But Elias, with the stubbornness of those who have already lost everything, pushed these thoughts away. He remembered his wife's smile, the promise he had made to her, and the image of the healing water shone in his mind, a beacon guiding him. The map indicated he was getting closer. A series of narrow, winding alleys seemed to lead to a central point. The smell of dampness and wet earth, even beneath the snow and ice, began to become noticeable, different from the dry, frozen air. There was a change in the environment, a feeling that life, in some way, still persisted. Elias felt a pang of hope, but also of apprehension. What else did Ethelberg hold in its depths? He reached a passage that looked like the entrance to an underground chamber. Two massive columns, cracked and moss-covered, flanked the opening. The air coming from within was heavier, more humid. The map showed the water drop symbol there, indicating the end of the journey. Elias's heart hammered in his chest, a mix of relief and dread. Exhaustion threatened him. His knees trembled painfully, his vision blurred. With the last drop of strength, he dragged himself inside. The deep darkness was almost absolute, but a faint, bluish, mysterious glow emanated from within. The sound of running water, a soft and constant murmur, filled the sepulchral silence. It was the fountain of life. Elias fell to his knees on the damp earth, his grandchildren still clinging to him. Tears streamed down his face, not of sadness, but of overwhelming gratitude. He had arrived, fulfilled his promise. Now, only the healing remained. He looked at Leo and Maya, their pale faces illuminated by the bluish light of the spring. They were so fragile. The image of his wife appeared, an encouraging smile. Elias knew he could not fail. With monumental effort, he dragged himself to the edge of the spring. The water, clear and bright, seemed to invite him, promising the life he so desperately sought. He extended his trembling hand, ready to touch the hope that Ethelberg had finally revealed. His wrinkled fingers brushed the water's surface, and a sensation of gentle warmth, like a soft embrace, coursed through his exhausted body. It wasn't the aggressive heat of fever, but a vital energy that seemed to soothe every aching muscle, every weary bone. The water was not cold like the snow outside, nor warm, but possessed a perfect inviting temperature. Elias cupped some water in his hands, watching it glow with an even more intense blue. With a sigh of faith and desperation, he brought the water to Leo's lips. The boy, who had previously whimpered and trembled, seemed to sense the spring's proximity. His eyes, previously fixed on emptiness, blinked slowly, and he opened his mouth with minimal effort. Elias carefully poured the water drop by drop into Leo's mouth. With each sip, a subtle yet profound change seemed to occur. The boy's pale skin began to regain a rosier hue, and his breathing, previously ragged, became softer, more rhythmic. The fever's heat in his body subsided, and a visible relaxation spread through his limbs. Elias felt a lump in his throat, tears of relief streaming freely. Next, he turned to Maya. The girl was even more fragile, her small hand still clinging to her grandfather's tunic. With the same delicacy, Elias offered her the water. Maya, with half-closed eyes, also accepted the sips, one by one. The effect was equally miraculous. The trembling in her body ceased, and her faint breath gained strength. A faint blush appeared on her cheeks, and her lips, previously dry and cracked, seemed to soften. She let out a deep sigh, a sound of peace Elias hadn't heard in days, and her hand tightened a little more on her grandfather's tunic, but now with the strength of one clinging to life, not on the verge of departure. Elias watched his grandchildren, his heart overflowing with gratitude he could barely contain. Leo and Maya were sleeping now, but it wasn't the restless, feverish sleep from before. It was a deep, restorative sleep, a sleep of healing. He felt the warmth of their bodies, no longer the heat of illness, but the warmth of life returning. The sight of their serene faces, free from the torment of fever, was the most beautiful landscape he could have imagined. With the certainty that they were safe, Elias felt his own exhaustion hit him with renewed force. He had forgotten himself, the hunger, the cold, the pain. With hands still damp from the miraculous water, he brought them to his own lips. The taste was pure, fresh, like nothing he had ever tasted. With each sip, a wave of energy spread through his body, washing away the weariness, pain, and hunger that tormented him. His muscles relaxed, his mind cleared, and his blurred vision became sharp. He felt stronger, younger, as if an immense weight had been lifted from his shoulders. The fountain of life not only healed his grandchildren, it healed him too, restoring his strength and hope. Elias looked at the shining water, then at his sleeping grandchildren, and a genuine, long-forgotten smile appeared on his face. Ethelberg, the city that seemed cursed, had revealed itself as a sanctuary, a place of renewal. He had found not a treasure of gold, but something infinitely more valuable, life and hope for his lineage. The future, which once seemed a dark abyss, now opened like an illuminated path, full of possibilities. Elias knew his journey didn't end there. In fact, it was just beginning with a new purpose and unwavering faith. The warmth the healing water had instilled in his body was a balm for his soul. Elias felt every muscle relaxed, every joint less painful. The hunger that gnawed at him had disappeared, replaced by a lightness he hadn't experienced in years. He knelt again beside Leo and Maya, observing their serene faces. Leo breathed deeply, his chest rising and falling at a steady rhythm, and a healthy flush had returned to his cheeks. Maya, nestled, had an almost imperceptible smile on her lips, as if dreaming of something good. The sight filled Elias's heart with an indescribable peace. He reached out and stroked Leo's sweaty hair, then Maya's, feeling the normal temperature of their foreheads. The miracle had happened. With his mind now clear and body invigorated, Elias noticed details of the chamber that had previously gone unnoticed in his exhaustion. The bluish light of the spring illuminated the stone walls, revealing carvings and symbols that told a silent story. He stood up, feeling an energy that urged him to explore. The chamber was larger than it first appeared, with niches and recesses that faded into the gloom. His eyes scanned the drawings on the walls, figures of people in long tunics, animals and plants, all seeming to converge on the water drop symbol, the same one that was on the map. It was as if the history of that place was etched to be read by those with the purity of heart to find it. Elias walked slowly, his steps firm but careful not to disturb his grandchildren's sleep. In one of the more distant niches, hidden by a rocky outcrop, he noticed something different. It wasn't an inscription, but a small metal plaque, green with age, embedded in the stone. With fingers that no longer trembled, he touched it. It was cold and smooth. With an effort, he managed to remove it, revealing a small cavity behind. Inside, there was an object wrapped in a silk cloth, surprisingly preserved. He unrolled it with reverence. It was an ancient bronze medallion with the same water drop symbol engraved, but with a peculiarity. Around the circle, there was a series of small runes he couldn't decipher, and in the center, a small crystal that shimmered with the same blue light as the spring. Behind the medallion, at the bottom of the cavity, Elias felt another scroll, smaller than the first. This one, however, was not a map. With hands trembling with a new emotion, he unrolled it. The calligraphy was elegant, but the words were different from the first inscription. The fountain of life is not merely to heal the body, but to awaken the soul of the earth. Its purity is a shield against the darkness that seeks to consume the world. Those who find it bear the burden of its protection, for the greed of powerful men will corrupt all it touches, seeking its power to dominate, not to heal. The guardian must be pure of heart, and their lineage the seed of renewal. Elias felt a chill down his spine, despite the warmth of the spring. The greed of powerful men. The words echoed in his mind, bringing back the pain of being driven from his lands, the injustice that had led him to Ethelberg. He was not just a grandfather seeking healing for his grandchildren. He had unknowingly become the guardian of something far greater. The medallion in his hand seemed to pulse with a subtle energy, and the crystal in its center shone more intensely. His eyes turned to Leo and Maya, sleeping peacefully. They were the seed of renewal, and he, old Elias, was the guardian, the hope that was once personal now transformed into an immense responsibility, a mission that extended far beyond the walls of that chamber. Ethelberg was not just a refuge, it was the beginning of a new battle, a battle for purity and justice against the very greed that had pursued him. The dawn of a new era, yes, but also the harbinger of challenges he could barely imagine. Elias clutched the medallion in his hand, feeling the cold bronze and the bluish crystal pulse with an energy that seemed to echo his own heartbeat. The revelation of the second scroll, with its solemn and terrifying words, hung over him like a cloud, dissipating the euphoria of healing. Guardian, seed of renewal, greed of powerful men. He, an old widower, bent by life and pain, was now the link in an ancestral chain, the protector of a secret that could change the destiny of many. His eyes moved from his sleeping grandchildren to the shimmering water of the spring, then to the inscriptions on the walls, which now seemed more than mere drawings, but a living map of his new and immense responsibility. A heavy sigh escaped his lips, laden with a mixture of relief and apprehension. The joy of Leo and Maya's healing was still fresh and sweet, but the sweetness was mixed with the bitterness of an unexpected burden. He had fled from greed, from injustice, and now he was called to confront it, not just for his family, but for a purpose that transcended his own existence. The idea was daunting. He was not a warrior, nor a sage from ancient tales. He was just Elias, a grandfather who loved deeply, and perhaps it was precisely this purity of heart that made him worthy, the unwavering presence of the love that moved him. He knelt again beside Leo and Maya, observing their angelic faces, now serene and with a faint, healthy flush. They were the reason for everything, the reason he had dragged himself through Ethelberg, and now the reason he would accept this new mission with every fiber of his being. Their small hands rested open, innocent, and Elias felt an even stronger wave of protection, a silent oath that he could not fail them, nor the promise that the spring seemed to whisper in its constant murmur. Ethelberg, which was once a refuge of despair, now became a sanctuary of hope and, paradoxically, a silent battlefield. A guardian's first task, he thought, was to protect the spring from curious eyes and covetous hands, to protect his grandchildren from any danger, and to protect himself so he could fulfill his duty. He needed to seal the entrance somehow, make it less visible, less accessible to those who were not worthy. His eyes scanned the chamber, searching for loose stones, rubble that could serve to disguise the opening. Physical exhaustion had been washed away by the water, but mental exhaustion still persisted, now with the complexity of a new and challenging purpose. He stood up, feeling the strength in his legs, and began to inspect the massive columns flanking the entrance. There were cracks, yes, and stone blocks that could be moved with effort and cunning. But first and foremost, he needed to ensure Leo and Maya were safe and warm, even with the fever already dissipated. The cold in the chamber was still intense. He unfolded the blankets, wrapping them more carefully, and moved them to a more sheltered niche, where the wind wouldn't reach them. He sat between them, the medallion still in his hand, the bluish light of the spring reflecting in his tired eyes, but now full of new determination. Hunger began to stir again, but now it was a different hunger, a hunger for purpose, for knowing what would come next and how he would prepare. The scroll didn't speak of how to fight with weapons, only of protecting the purity of the spring and the seed of renewal. Elias knew that the true fight would not be with swords, but with wisdom, with unwavering faith, and with the resilience of a spirit that refused to be broken. He would need to be cunning, invisible, like the shadows dancing in Ethelberg's ruins. The greed of the powerful was a faceless enemy, but he knew it all too well. He had felt it on his skin, in the loss of his wife, in the cruel expulsion from his lands. The night was still long outside, but inside the chamber, a new dawn was breaking for Elias. He looked at the medallion, then at his grandchildren. He was not alone. They were his strength, his inspiration, the reason for his renewed existence. Ethelberg, the city many considered cursed, had become the cradle of a new hope, and he, old Elias, its guardian. He took a deep breath, the damp, fresh air filling his lungs with the promise of an uncertain future, yet full of meaning. The battle would begin, and he would be ready for it. Elias let out a sigh, the damp, fresh air filling his lungs. The battle would begin, and he would be ready. With the warm medallion in his palm, he stood, new energy pulsing, though his mind still weighed heavily with the task. His eyes scanned the chamber entrance, the cracked and mossy columns. The icy wind attempting to infiltrate was a reminder of the sanctuary's vulnerability. He approached the opening, touching the cold, uneven stones. Fallen blocks and rubble were scattered across the snow and damp earth, remnants of a collapse. With a plan, Elias decided to use the rubble, stacking it to create a discreet barrier, one that would look like just another ruin of Ethelberg. It wouldn't be a fortress, but a disguise to protect the spring's secret, The first stone he tried to move was too heavy. His muscles, invigorated, were still those of an old man. He grunted with the effort, his brow furrowed, but the image of Leo and Maya's serene faces gave him strength. He could not fail. With cunning, Elias inspected the smaller stones, those that could be rolled or dragged. He found a sizable rock, but one shaped in a way that allowed him to leverage it with a piece of wood. With each stone moved, the sound echoed in the chamber, and Elias paused to check on his grandchildren. They slept deeply, oblivious to their grandfather's work. The silence of the abandoned city outside seemed to swallow the sounds of his effort, making the task more solitary. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes. Elias had lost track of time. His hands, once wrinkled, were now dirty with earth and moss, but firm. He carefully stacked the stones, filling the gaps, creating an improvised wall that concealed the chamber's entrance. Sweat ran down his forehead despite the cold. Physical exhaustion, pushed away by the water, threatened to return, but Elias's determination was stronger. He remembered the scroll's words, "The greed of powerful men will corrupt all it touches." That phrase was a whip in his memory, spurring him on. He didn't want the spring, which had saved his grandchildren, to fall into the hands of those who only sought power. Ethelberg had become his home, and he would protect it with the same ferocity with which he protected Leo and Maya. Upon finishing stacking the stones, Elias stepped back, assessing his work. The entrance was almost unrecognizable, blending perfectly with the surrounding ruins. It was a simple, effective disguise against unsuspecting eyes. He felt a momentary relief, a small triumph in his vast mission. His eyes turned to Leo and Maya. Leo coughed softly in his sleep, a sound that would once cause panic, but now was a sign of life and recovery. Maya stirred, snuggling deeper into the blanket. Elias approached, sitting down beside them again, the medallion in his hand. He stroked Maya's hair, feeling the healthy warmth of her skin. They were the seed, and he, the guardian. The responsibility was immense, but the love he felt for them was his greatest strength. The sun began to peek through the ruins, a new dawn, and with it, the promise of a new day in Ethelberg. The sun, a pale and cold disk, finally broke through the heavy clouds, casting faint rays over Ethelberg's frozen ruins. The light, though weak, brought a new perspective for Elias. He watched his grandchildren, Leo and Maya, still asleep in their sheltered niche. The healthy flush on their faces was the most eloquent proof of the spring's miracle. The medallion was still in his hand, the bluish crystal catching the faint light and emitting a subtle glow, like a heart beating in sync with his own. The responsibility of being a guardian was not something one could simply ignore with the rising sun. Elias felt the weight of the scroll's words. "The greed of powerful men will corrupt all it touches," echoing in his mind. He had sealed the entrance, but he knew it was only a temporary measure. True protection would come from constant vigilance and the wisdom to act at the right moment. But how? He was an old man, not a warrior. His strength lay in love, resilience, and faith. Leo stirred, a small whimper escaping his lips, and his eyes slowly opened. He blinked, confused for an instant, before his eyes met Elias's. A faint but genuine smile appeared on his pale face. "Grandpa?" he whispered, his voice still hoarse, but with a clarity Elias hadn't heard in days. Elias felt a tightening in his chest, an emotion so pure it made him swallow hard. He leaned in, stroking the boy's hair. "Yes, my little one, I'm here." Maya also began to awaken, her brown eyes opening to the new day. She stretched, a small yawn, and looked at Leo and then at Elias. A radiant smile lit up her face. "I'm hungry, Grandpa," she said, her voice weak but full of renewed vitality. Those words, "I'm hungry," were music to Elias's ears. They meant life, recovery. Hunger, once a sign of despair, was now a symbol of hope. Elias felt immense relief. The fever was gone, the weakness dissipating. But hunger was a cruel reminder of reality. Ethelberg was a sanctuary, but not a granary. He needed to find food, and soon. The thought of leaving the chamber, of venturing again into the icy ruins, brought a pang of apprehension. He had promised to protect the spring, but he also needed to protect his grandchildren from the hunger and cold that still persisted outside. He stood up, feeling the strength in his legs, but also the need for caution. "Come, my loves, Grandpa will find something for you to eat," he said, his voice soft but firm. He helped Leo and Maya sit up, wrapping them in blankets. The two leaned on him, their small bodies still a little fragile, but with an energy they hadn't possessed before. As his grandchildren nestled, Elias looked at the disguised entrance. No one would suspect that behind those stones lay a source of life, but the city was vast and human curiosity even greater. He knew that danger would come not only from the greed of the powerful, but also from simple discovery by a lost traveler or a looter. He needed to be smarter, more vigilant. Ethelberg, which was once merely an endpoint in his escape, now revealed itself as a new beginning, full of challenges and promises. Elias clutched the medallion again, feeling the crystal pulse. He was not just a grandfather. He was the guardian of a hope that extended beyond his own family, a hope for the land and for those who inhabited it with purity of heart. The journey had only just begun, and Elias was ready for every step, guided by love and unwavering faith. He kissed Maya's forehead, then Leo's, a tender gesture that sealed his commitment. "Stay here, quietly. Grandpa won't be long." With a heavy heart, but a focused mind, Elias headed for the disguised entrance. With a gentle push, one of the stones moved enough for him to peek outside. The icy morning air invaded the chamber, bringing the scent of snow and ancient stone. The pale sunlight revealed a desolate scene, but now, for Elias, every ruin was a challenge to be overcome, not a reminder of defeat. He slipped through the gap, carefully closing it behind him, blending back into Ethelberg's landscape. The city waited, and with it the promise of a new day and the search for sustenance. Elias slipped through the gap, the icy morning air cutting his wrinkled face. He pulled the stone back, camouflaging the chamber's entrance with the dexterity necessity had taught him. The pale sun barely warmed the ruins, and the snow, covering the uneven ground, crunched under his worn boots. Every step was an effort, not from weakness, but from caution. His eyes, once fixed on immediate survival, now swept the horizon of crumbled stones with keen vigilance, searching not only for food, but for any sign of danger. Hunger was a tangible enemy, but the fear that others' greed might reach Ethelberg was a persistent shadow. He moved among the rubble, his steps echoing in the city's heavy silence. The ancient houses, now stone skeletons, seemed to watch his journey with empty eyes. Elias searched for any remnant of life, perhaps a bush with frozen berries, or a small animal that might have ventured through the ruins. His hands, calloused by time and labor, felt along the cold walls, seeking any crevice that might hide a treasure of sustenance. He remembered the times when food was abundant in his lands before the powerful's greed took them. The memory was a goad, reinforcing his determination. As he approached what seemed to have been an ancient market, a chill ran down his spine, not from the cold, but from a strange sensation. On the ground, between the snow and frozen earth, there was something that didn't belong to Ethelberg's natural desolation, a fresh footprint, large and deep, that wasn't his own. Elias's heart leaped. He crouched, his fingers trembling slightly as he touched the mark. It wasn't an animal's, it was a man's, and it seemed to have been made recently, perhaps the night before. His eyes narrowed, sweeping the area with renewed urgency. Ethelberg was no longer a forgotten refuge, Someone had been there. The scroll's phrase reverberated in his mind. The greed of powerful men will corrupt all it touches. Could it be that those who drove him from his lands had discovered his whereabouts, or that others, drawn by rumors of ancient treasures, were exploring the city? Elias felt a knot in his throat. Leo and Maya, so fragile, so dependent. The spring, the secret he had sworn to protect. He stood up, the search for food momentarily forgotten, replaced by a more pressing need to understand the threat. With more cautious steps, he followed the trail. The footprints led to the city center, towards the tallest crumbled tower, an observation point that dominated the entire landscape. Elias felt a chill in his stomach. If someone was there to observe, it meant Ethelberg was being watched. As he approached the base of the tower, a distant, almost inaudible sound reached his ears. A metallic clink, muffled by the wind, followed by a murmur of voices. Elias hid behind a collapsed wall, his old body tense, the medallion in his hand warming. He carefully peeked. Atop the tower, against the pale sky, two dark figures moved. They were men, armed, and seemed to be standing guard, their gazes sweeping the ruins below. The sight made Elias's blood run cold. They were not lost travelers, they were sentinels. Greed, he realized with an icy shock, had already reached Ethelberg. Not for the spring specifically, perhaps, but their presence there so close was an imminent danger. The sanctuary of hope he had built for his grandchildren was under direct threat. The climax of his journey was not healing, but the battle for the protection of what he had found. Elias retreated slowly, every muscle protesting, his heart pounding in his chest. He needed to go back to Leo and Maya. He needed to think. Ethelberg was no longer a refuge, but a battlefield, and he, old Elias, the guardian, was at its center. The silent fight for the spring's purity and his grandchildren's lives had begun, and the enemy, though still unknown in their exact purposes, was already lurking. Elias retreated, his heart pounding. The medallion pulsed, reminding him of what was at stake. In the chamber, Leo and Maya slept, serene. Their innocence ignited a protective fury. He would not allow darkness to touch them. He sat down, hunger forgotten. How would an old man face armed men? The answer lay in wisdom, cunning, and faith. Ethelberg would be his ally. He observed the ruins. A subtle idea formed to reinforce the legend of cursed Ethelberg, making it inhospitable and worthless to the greedy. He waited for the sun to rise. When Leo and Maya awoke, he embraced them. "My loves, Grandpa needs help," he said, his voice calm and determined. "We're going to play hide and seek. Be very quiet." He explained they would look for hidden treasures, stones and moss, near the chamber, always with him. The purpose was to observe the men in the tower, who would descend to warm themselves, leaving it unoccupied. It was then that Elias acted. He knew the spring was the true treasure, but to the greedy, gold and power mattered. He remembered a legend of spirits protecting Ethelberg. With his hoarse, resonant voice, Elias whispered ancient chants. He hid among the tower's ruins, waiting for the men's vulnerable moment. When the figures descended to the campfire, Elias, with the unwitting help of Leo and Maya, who scattered stones and branches, created an illusion. He dragged loose stones, creating noises, and used the wind to make his whispers seem to come from all directions. The men, tense and superstitious, grew uneasy. Elias watched them, his heart pounding, but with growing calm. They looked at each other, nervous, pointing at the shadows. The resolution came subtly. Elias appealed to their fear of the unknown. He continued with the whispers, arranging the ruins to appear even more uninhabited and frightening. The men, unable to find obvious treasure and confronted by the spirits, packed their few belongings. Elias saw one of them gesture angrily at the tower and the city. "There's nothing here but ghosts!" As evening fell, the two figures descended from the tower for the last time. They didn't look back. hurrying out of Ethelberg's limits, their silhouettes diminishing against the pale horizon. Elias watched until they disappeared. A deep sigh of relief escaped his lips. Ethelberg was safe again. He returned to Leo and Maya, who awaited him with shining eyes. "Grandpa found the greatest treasure of all," he said, hugging them tightly. "You." The city, once a battlefield, was now a sanctuary of peace, protected by wisdom and love. Hope, once faint, wove itself into a fabric of renewal and purpose. Life in Ethelberg would be challenging, but family unity and the healing spring were the foundation for a resilient future. Elias pressed Leo and Maya against him, feeling the warmth of their small bodies, their soft breaths against his chest. Those words, "you," echoed in his mind, more precious than any gold. Ethelberg, once a labyrinth of shadows and fears, now revealed itself as the cradle of a future he had never dared to dream of. The days that followed were woven with the delicacy of a new dawn. A routine was established, simple and full of purpose. Every morning, after a silent prayer of gratitude, Elias took his grandchildren to the spring. The crystal-clear water, which had once healed their bodies, now nourished their souls, filling them with serene energy. Leo and Maya, with a healthy flush back in their faces, ran through the ruins near the chamber, their laughter echoing where before there had only been silence. Elias watched them, his heart overflowing. He taught them to identify the few edible plants that sprouted among the stones, to recognize the sounds of the small animals that ventured there. Hunting and gathering became an art of survival, guided by necessity, but also by the wisdom of not taking more than was needed. The medallion, always around his neck, was no longer just an amulet, but a constant reminder of his promise and his deep connection to the earth. The spring chamber, with its carefully disguised entrance, became the heart of their new home. Elias, with his grandchildren's help, transformed one of the most sheltered niches into a small refuge, with warm blankets and a controlled fire that warmed the cold nights. Leo and Maya helped gather twigs and dry moss, feeling like an essential part of this new world. Their eyes, once full of fear, now shone with the curiosity and joy of those discovering a universe of possibilities. Each day, Elias felt strength return to his limbs, not the brute force of youth, but a resilience forged by pain and overcoming. He spent hours exploring Ethelberg, no longer with the desperation of flight, but with the vision of a builder. He repaired small sections of walls, cleared rubble, creating safe paths for his grandchildren. The city, slowly, began to breathe again under his care. The memory of the greed that had driven him from his lands still persisted, but not as an open wound, rather as a scar that reminded him of the importance of protecting what was pure. Ethelberg would not be a place of treasures for the powerful, but a sanctuary for those who valued life, family, and connection to nature. Elias dreamed of a future where Leo and Maya could grow up free, learning the secrets of the spring and the wisdom of the earth. One afternoon, as the sun set, painting the sky in orange hues over the ruins, Elias sat with his grandchildren, each nestled on one of his sides. Leo pointed to the horizon. "Grandpa, one day will we build a bigger house here, with a garden?" Elias smiled, stroking Maya's hair. "Yes, my little one. One day, and it will be a house full of love and hope." He looked at the vast expanse of Ethelberg, now a home, a legacy. The cursed city had been redeemed not by gold or power, but by the unwavering faith of a grandfather and the love he nurtured for his grandchildren. The healing spring was more than a miracle. It was a symbol of renewal, of the human capacity to find light even in the deepest darkness. Elias felt a profound peace. The journey had come to an end, but the story of Ethelberg and Elias's lineage was just beginning, a silent testament to the strength of family and the resilience of the human spirit. They were the guardians of a promise, the builders of a new world, rooted in hope and gratitude. The profound peace Elias felt was not the stillness of resignation, but the serenity of renewed purpose. Ethelberg, once an echo of sadness, now pulsed with the life he and his grandchildren planted there. The days stretched into a harmonious dance between work and contemplation. Elias continued to explore the ruins, no longer with the urgency of survival, but with the vision of an architect of hope. He didn't build walls for defense, but for shelter. With smaller stones and clay taken from a nearby stream, he began to repair one of the wider niches, transforming it into a more comfortable dwelling. With a fireplace that radiated warmth and a soft scent of wood smoke, Leo and Maya, with restored health and robust bodies, were his tireless little helpers. Their curious eyes discovered the city's secrets, every stone, every crevice, an invitation to imagination. Elias taught them to recognize the stars, to listen to the wind's whispers among the ruins, and to respect the nature that surrounded them. Their laughter was the melody that filled Ethelberg's silence, a sound Elias held in his heart as the most precious of treasures. The spring, his private miracle, was visited in silence and reverence, its secret kept under lock and key, but its essence, purity and life, permeated every aspect of their new home. One morning, as Leo and Maya gathered frozen berries near a collapsed wall, an unusual sound broke the stillness. It wasn't the wind, nor the rustling of an animal. It was a faint groan, followed by a dragging of hesitant footsteps. Elias felt a tightening in his chest, the old fear of intrusion returning for an instant. He signaled for his grandchildren to be quiet and hid behind a broken column, peeking out cautiously. A figure emerged from among the ruins, stumbling and visibly exhausted. It was a man, not one of the armed sentinels from before, but a solitary traveler, his clothes torn, his face pale and marked by hunger and weariness. He dragged himself, his eyes fixed on the ground, as if each step were his last. Elias watched, the medallion in his hand warming. Greed did not seem to be what brought him there, but the same vulnerability that he and his grandchildren had once known. The man collapsed near a dry well, a hoarse sigh escaping his lips. Elias felt compassion overcome caution. He remembered his own pain, the thirst and hunger that had almost claimed Leo and Maya's lives. Slowly, Elias emerged from his hiding place, his steps soft on the snow. Leo and Maya, curious, peeked from behind the column, their small faces serious. "My friend," Elias said, his voice calm and gentle, "do you need help?" The man raised his head, his eyes wide with surprise and fear. He tried to stand, but his legs gave way. "Water," he whispered, his voice almost inaudible. Elias nodded. He couldn't reveal the spring, but he could share its fruits. With a reassuring gesture, he approached, offering him a leather canteen he always carried, filled with the pure, revitalizing water from the spring. The man drank eagerly, life slowly returning to his eyes. Elias also offered him a piece of dry bread and some berries, which Leo and Maya brought with their small hands. The traveler, whose name was Theron, told his story of fleeing distant lands, ravaged by the same greed that had driven Elias away. He sought refuge, a place where he could find peace. Elias welcomed him, offering him shelter in the niche he had repaired and sharing the simplicity of his life in Ethelberg. Theron, as the days passed, regained his strength, marveling at the serenity of the place and the kindness of Elias and his grandchildren. He didn't ask about the source of the water or the origin of their food. He simply accepted the gift with silent gratitude. When Theron finally felt strong enough to continue his journey, his eyes were filled with new hope. "Ethelberg is not cursed, Elias," he said, shaking the old man's hand. "It is a sanctuary, a place where kindness still flourishes." Elias watched Theron leave, his figure diminishing on the horizon. He knew that Ethelberg's story would not end there. Theron would carry with him not the legend of a golden treasure, but the truth of a spiritual refuge where human connection and faith could heal the deepest wounds. Elias smiled, embracing Leo and Maya. Ethelberg was not just a home for his lineage, but a promise that extended, a beacon of hope in a world that so desperately needed it. They were the guardians of a new dawn.